I'd like to tell you another story about my first intensive meditation retreat. As an American kid, I grew up with the notion of external freedom and choice being very deeply ingrained. I felt I shouldn't have dress codes at school, and traditional sexual mores didn't seem very necessary. The freedom to choose what I wanted to do, when I wanted to do it, seemed most important. The strict schedule of no talking, no freedom to choose of the retreat seemed antithetical to freedom. But I discovered that within the context of that strictness, real freedom became possible. How was that? Well, it turns out that mindfulness opens up a gap between sensation, an emotion or other bodily experience, the urge or impulse to do something about it, and then the movement that flows from that urge, our behavior. In non-mindful daily life, we rarely notice this gap. The realization that I could learn to simply be with rather than fix experiences was remarkably liberating. I found I could actually choose whether or not to act on my desires. Even little desires like scratching an itch or moving when my leg hurt from sitting for a long time, or seeking entertainment by reading, talking, or the things I'd do outside the retreat like visiting the fridge or turning on the TV. And when I chose not to pursue some of them, I found that I felt freer than ever before. Years later, when I became a clinical psychologist, I realized that the same principle could help to free us from a remarkably wide range of common problems. And this is nowhere more obvious than in dealing with addictions. Now, almost all of us have some habits that we'd like to change. Some are relatively harmless, like overeating from time to time, checking our smartphones a bit too often, watching TV more than we should, or perhaps procrastinating a bit on chores or work. But others can be quite destructive, including alcoholism and other forms of substance abuse, sexual addictions, compulsive gambling. There's quite a list. All of these addictions involve a principle which we've discussed before in the course. It's our hardwired impulse to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Ironically, just as I saw in retreat, we can break free from being enslaved by our habits, but first we have to be willing to give up some of what we might think of as our freedom. With mindfulness practice, we see that we're actually all addicts. We see that much of our behavior is automatic and compulsive. We don't notice this unless we pay attention. But when we're mindful, we can see that we're thinking all day about how to try to feel good and avoid feeling bad. And this can really be quite subtle. The process begins with our hardwired, evolutionarily determined predilection to seek pleasurable experiences and avoid painful ones. And then it's exacerbated by our thinking disease, because we're able to anticipate the future, recall the past, and make plans to maximize future pleasure and minimize future pain. It's great for survival. But when we're successful at this, our efforts are actually positively reinforced, and that can become quite addictive. In traditional Buddhist language, the tendency to hold on to the pleasant, avoid the unpleasant, and ignore neutral experiences are called greed, hatred, and delusion. They're referred to as poisons, or unwholesome roots, or fires that control our behavior. And it's these hardwired tendencies that lead to a remarkable range of addictions. There are so many possibilities. We can ingest substances like alcohol, other drugs, like nicotine or caffeine, and we become easily imprisoned by compulsions toward any of these. There are other compulsive activities like over or under eating, sex, love, or abusive relationships. We can get addicted to gambling, to shopping, to work. We can even get addicted to religious activity, including meditation practices. And in the modern age, we have the options for internet surfing, texting, video games, all sorts of things that we can become compulsively attached to. So how do we get hooked? Well, there are many models out there. When I was in training, a popular one was put forth by a psychiatrist named Edward Kanzian, who was actually at the Cambridge Hospital where I worked. And he said, when we're doing these addictive habits, we're actually medicating underlying psychiatric conditions, such as anxiety or depression. And in fact, he had a whole system for looking at what our compulsive behaviors were and kind of reverse engineering it to figure out what probably was the underlying difficulty. The idea was that certain activities tend to treat certain underlying problems. We also have evidence that some of us have genetic predispositions toward becoming addicted to certain substances, for example. But most experts in addiction these days say that whatever else might be going on, we learn to be addicts through predictable mechanisms of positive and negative reinforcement. One particularly clear model comes from Dr. Judson Brewer, a friend and colleague of mine at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. His model talks about associative learning addictive loops. Smoking, drinking, or whatever the other addictive behavior is becomes associated with positive and negative feelings through positive and negative reinforcement. Now, positive reinforcement refers to a pleasurable experience that follows a behavior, like ingesting a substance, and makes it more likely that we'll repeat the behavior as a result because it felt good. Negative reinforcement, which we talked about before in terms of anxiety problems, like fleeing the supermarket when we're anxious, that refers to the removal of a painful experience that comes from an addictive behavior. In other words, the addictive behavior removes the painful experience, and that makes it more likely that we'll do it again in the future. Some examples of positive reinforcement can be feeling high when we have a drink, having fun, being funny, having sex, connecting with friends, really any good feeling that comes from the addictive behavior. Negative reinforcement usually involves reductions in anxiety, worry, sadness, anger, boredom, or some other unpleasant emotion. Once we've had some experience with our addictive behavior, once we've done it a number of times, then we get triggered by cues. Positive cues like seeing the cigarette, the beer, the candy bar, the gambling casino gets us jazzed up and makes us desire it again. And negative cues like feeling stressed out, lonely, anxious, depressed, that triggers a cue-induced craving to get rid of the negative feeling. After the urge, we typically do the addictive behavior. We have the smoke or the drink, eat the cake, or go to the casino. And this makes the unpleasant feeling go away temporarily, or it brings on a good feeling for a little while. And that creates more positive or negative reinforcement, increasing the likelihood that we'll reenact the problematic behavior. And this just goes on, and through repetition, the process becomes quite automated over time. Now, conventional treatments don't actually dismantle this addictive loop. Many conventional treatments either target the avoidance of positive and negative cues, or they target learning to enact substitute behaviors so we don't do the addictive behavior. The avoidance of cues is things like, well, stay away from bars and liquor stores, stay away from casinos and bakeries, and that dampens the input into the addictive loop. While substitute behaviors, things like calling a friend when you're tempted to drink or gamble, or eating carrot sticks when you're tempted to eat the chocolate cake, that circumvents the addictive behavior for a little while, but it doesn't do anything with our underlying craving. So the alternative is to try to change our relationship to craving. And this is where mindfulness practice comes in, because it can help us to do just that. Now, traditionally, many religious and philosophic traditions have tried asceticism to actually kill off cravings. And in that way, they try to get us away from the pain of unfulfilled desires, and they use them to interrupt unwholesome habits. We can see this in the story of the Buddha's life, when he tried to do the same thing during his ascetic period. And the Buddha was very good at what he did, so he took it to the max. Here's what the traditional description is of how he was as an ascetic. He tried various plans, such as abstaining from rice meal and living on fruits which dropped from trees. Then on fruits which dropped only from the tree under which he sat. Then living on only one fruit, one sesame seed, or 1 grain of rice a day. By this lack of nourishment, his body was reduced to skin and bones and lost its golden color and became dry and black. And if you travel to Buddhist cultures, you'll see various kinds of artwork that depict this totally emaciated, half-dead Buddha during his ascetic period. But the Buddha found that this didn't actually provide a path to psychological freedom. He was still constantly wrestling with his desires. And the failure of his ascetic strategy is actually what led him to develop mindfulness practices, the same sorts of mindfulness practices that we're discussing in this course. So how did mindfulness practices help the Buddha, and how can it help us to work differently or transform our desires and cravings? It's because they give us a way to forge a new relationship with craving. We learn to accept the changing experience instead of compulsively chasing pleasure and avoiding pain. We basically learn how to ride it out. The other thing we learn from mindfulness practice is not to take our relapses so seriously. The times we slip, the times we go and have the chocolate cake or have the drink, stop being such a big issue about how we failed, but they start being new opportunities to start afresh. Let's examine the first approach, how we change the relationship to cravings. What we're going to learn how to do is to be with feelings rather than act compulsively to try to get rid of them. This begins by just noticing whatever sensation is happening right now in the mind and in the body. Then it's noticing the impulse to fix or escape it. And what we get to see is that these impulses wax and wane, and we become conscious of their constantly changing nature. Most compulsive behaviors occur because we believe that we can't tolerate the experience and therefore must act to change it. Or we have the mistaken belief that unpleasant experiences will last forever if we don't take action to interrupt them. And mindfulness practice helps us to see that neither of these beliefs is actually true. We've discussed before how mindfulness practices help to increase our capacity to bear experience. Remember the Zen master who could be run through with a sword without blinking an eye? This is what I saw develop, to an admittedly lesser degree, on my first retreat, where giving up one kind of freedom yielded a much more valuable one. Now, since compulsive behaviors are designed to reduce the intensity of unpleasant experiences or to ensure pleasant ones, if we can ride the waves of pleasant and unpleasant feelings, we're not going to be driven so hard toward our compulsive behaviors. And if we don't reenact them, then they won't be continually positively and negatively reinforced. So we won't have the learning loop that gets us so trapped in them. Now, what might motivate a person to take this approach? To move toward what's unpleasant and away from what's pleasant, or to give up the freedom to satisfy immediate desires? You know, in the old days, when I was first in training, psychotherapists used to demand abstinence from people who had addictions before agreeing to treat them in psychotherapy. So if an alcoholic came to see us, the idea was, well, you have to go over to AA, you have to become dry, and then we'll do psychotherapy. But in later years, some people working with the addiction said, you know, this is a little bit like having somebody come into your office who's depressed and saying, go home, cheer up, and when you come back feeling better, we'll do some work together. So now we take a different, somewhat more investigative approach. Somebody comes in with an addictive behavior, and typically a therapist will ask, well, what do you enjoy about it? How does it improve your life? What might you lose if you gave it up? This method is often called motivational interviewing, and it's based on the idea that people have different levels of motivation for change at any given moment. And it's related to some scientific work on change that began with smoking cessation. This was done by James Prochaska and Carlo Di Clemente back in the early 1980s, and it's become a model for working with troublesome behaviors generally. You can try this for yourself now. Think of a habit that you have at least some wish to alter. Come up with one. Think of one in your mind first so you can follow along. You got it? What feels good about the habit? Whether it's drinking, smoking cigarettes, eating a lot, eating junk food, surfing the net, checking your smartphone, whatever it is. What feels good about the habit? What benefits does it offer you? And then what might you lose if you were to give it up, even if you just relinquished it sometimes? Now, after getting a sense of the behavior's benefits, look at its drawbacks. Does the habit cause you any difficulties? Do you imagine it might someday? Does it create any risks? Not immediate difficulties, but things that could go wrong in the future. And then finally, on balance, does it enrich your life or detract from it? Have you ever tried to stop or cut back? And if so, what happened? So in working with habits in this way, we first do this assessment so that we can address it in a kind of stage-based way, because we need different approaches depending on our relationship to the addiction. What stage we are determines what we're ready to do. Prochaska and Di Clemente came up with 6 habit change stages, and most people working in habit change fields talk to their clients or patients about these. The first is pre-contemplation. That's when we don't have any awareness that life could be improved by changing our behavior. It's not even on the table. And then there's contemplation, where we see, it's a problem, but we're not really ready to do much about it, but we're gathering a little bit of information about what might help. Then people move on to what's called preparation, and this is where you start to really think, about the pros and cons of doing this, and think, maybe I really should take some action. And then finally we move into action. We actually start attending AA, take up a mindfulness practice, go to the exercise class. Once we've taken the action and we've actually started changing the behavior, then there are other stages of maintenance, which is consolidating the changes, and finally termination, because at the end we get to a point where we no longer miss the habit. You don't even think smoking a cigarette would be at all pleasurable anymore. Sometimes we get to that point, sometimes we don't, depending on what the habit is. Now, there are a number of programs that explicitly use mindfulness practice to change our relationship to craving. And these programs actually offer us techniques that any of us can use in working with our own troublesome habits. One of them is mindfulness-based relapse prevention. And this was started by Alan Marlott and his colleagues at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the idea was to help people who had become free from a habit not to fall back into it. And the main thrust is giving us a new relationship to craving. First, what we do in this program is to simply develop mindfulness and watch every time we seem to go on automatic pilot and every time that a craving occurs. And then we start to develop mindfulness of the positive cues, the bars, the liquor stores, noticing what kinds of things in our environment bring up this feeling of, yes, I want to do the behavior. And then it gets interesting. We start practicing mindfulness, being with the breath, doing walking meditation in high-risk situations to identify where they are and practice entering the situation and being mindful there. This could include walking into a bar, sitting down, and doing mindfulness practice, and just noticing everything that comes up. One of the best and most important innovations of the mindfulness-based relapse prevention program is the idea of working with abstinence violation effects. Now, abstinence violation effects are what happens when we fall off the wagon. And we all fall off the wagon when we're trying to change a habit. We're dieting and then suddenly we go out to dinner and overdo it. We've been trying not to drink for a long time, a social situation comes up, and we start drinking again. Many, many different examples of this. Usually what happens when we fall off the wagon is we feel so terrible about having just screwed up that we then want to self-soothe. And what do we do to self-soothe? We go and eat more, or we go and have the drink. So we get caught in a loop in which a little slip becomes the entree to a whole pathway of being addicted once again to the problematic behavior. Just noticing this and noticing that it's an impersonal process and using mindfulness practice to notice the upwelling of negative feeling that comes after a slip can help us to not act compulsively on it and not go back to the substance. Another very useful contribution of this program is the practice of urge surfing. And this helps us to be mindful of cravings in a different way. Let me give you a little example of urge surfing, because we've all done it in one particular circumstance. It's a little indelicate, but this is the best one I know for illustrating this. Have you ever been in a situation like on an airplane and the fasten your seatbelt sign is on, where you needed to go to the bathroom and you weren't able to, or perhaps you were in a bus and it wasn't going to stop for a while? That's an example in which all of us have had experience in urge surfing. It goes something like this. Oh gosh, I think I gotta go. Oh yeah, I gotta go. Well, I can hold it for a little while, it'll be okay. Gosh, I really gotta go. I really gotta go. How long is this gonna be? I really gotta go. All right, just breathe a little bit. Don't relax too much, but it'll be okay. Oh, I really, really gotta go. I really gotta go. You've been there, right? What happens is the urge comes, reaches a kind of crescendo, and then settles down. It comes and reaches a kind of crescendo and settles down. It's interesting, when we have to go to the bathroom, it usually feels just when we finally get to the bathroom like, thank God, I definitely could not have held this for another moment, even though we probably could have held it longer. So let's try a little urge surfing right now. See if you can locate some kind of urge or craving right now in your experience. Maybe even something like you want a drink of water, you're a little hungry, maybe you need the bathroom a little bit. Try visualizing the urge or craving as an ocean wave. Begins as a small wavelet, then it builds into a cresting wave. And what we do in urge surfing is to use the breath as a kind of surfboard to ride the wave. So just breathe as you feel the urge. And the goal is to surf the urge by allowing it first to rise up and decline without being wiped out by giving into the urge. In urge surfing, we treat urges as conditioned responses that are triggered by environmental cues and emotional reactivity. And we see our conditioned responses to these grow in intensity, the craving, until it reaches a peak level and then fall off. Every time we surf the urge and don't actually enact the behavior, the reinforcement pattern is weakened. Basically what happens is as we learn to be with difficult experience and surf our cravings rather than act on them, our conditioned responses, the poisons or fires in Buddhist psychology, are extinguished. So then we needn't be so careful anymore to avoid positive or negative cues, nor do we have to find alternative behaviors. We can just be mindful of our changing experience and in that way grow free from our addiction. Now, there's an unusual form of mindfulness practice that you can try to understand more clearly your relationship to potentially addictive intoxicants in particular, things like alcohol or other mind-altering drugs. And this exercise wouldn't be helpful if you already know you have a problem with drinking or some other substance and you know you're trying to be abstinent. But for many of us, we drink alcohol or maybe even use other drugs sometimes, perhaps after work or with dinner at social gatherings, and we may not have noticed that they have a deleterious effect, but it could be helpful to see more clearly how they affect us. This exercise can help us to do just that. So if you're not needing to abstain, you might try this little exercise in mindful intoxication the next time you ordinarily would drink or use another substance. So this is an exercise in mindful intoxication. And once again, don't try this if you know that drinking or using another substance isn't a good idea for you, if you know you've got a problem with it. Use it, though, if you want to investigate the matter. And I'm going to use alcohol as an example, but we can use the same exercise with any mind-altering substance. You'll start with a few minutes of sitting meditation practice. Settle into your seat, notice your breathing, and try to follow the breath for complete cycles. I'd advise that you take 10 or 20 minutes of breath meditation before moving on to the next step of imbibing. Notice all the thoughts and feelings that arise as you meditate, both the pleasant ones, such as anticipation of what you're about to do, and perhaps the unpleasant ones, things you rather escape, that maybe the drink is going to make you feel better about. And once your mind has settled a bit, and you've had a chance to attend to your breath, have a drink. Take just enough to bring about some changes in your awareness, but not so much as to seriously interfere with your ability to pay attention. And once you've had your drink, go back to following your breath. Notice what you experience in your body. Notice the thoughts and feelings that arise in the mind. Let yourself be aware of aspects of alcohol that are pleasant and those that are unpleasant. If urges to drink more come up, just watch them arise, reach a crescendo, and perhaps diminish again. And after a few minutes of being with intoxicated experience, drink some more and observe what happens. And then simply continue alternating between drinking a little more and meditating on the effects until you reach a point that seems like enough to you. After the exercise, ask yourself, what did you discover being mindful of your substance use in this way? How did you determine your stopping point? And see if you can carry some of this awareness into normal circumstances in which you drink alcohol or use other substances. Now, troublesome eating habits can be particularly tricky because unlike intoxicants, abstinence here isn't an option. There are programs like Overeaters Anonymous where we abstain from particularly addictive foods like simple carbohydrates, but in general, you have to eat. Now, one mindfulness program that tries to deal with the challenge is called MB-EAT, Mindfulness-Based Eating Awareness Training. This was developed by Jean Christeller at Indiana State University. It uses a number of techniques that anyone working with an eating habit problem can use. They start with simply learning mindfulness meditation, and then they do a very slow eating exercise such as the raisin exercise. And then they move on to mindfully eating something bigger, like cheese and crackers. And they use the body scan, which is a form of mindfulness practice in which you start at one end of the body, either the head or the feet, and systematically feel all the different areas of the body to notice the effects of food on the body. Then they have some other techniques which are really quite interesting. They do hunger meditation, which involves paying attention to the sense of hunger and try to differentiate physical hunger from emotional hunger. And then they do taste satiety meditation, and this is noticing the craving for sensations of food in the mouth and learning to be with the sensation. Just notice how it feels to really want it in the mouth. And this is different from stomach satiety meditation, where we notice whether we feel full or not in the stomach. So we really start to see what's hunger about and what does fullness feel like and what are the different ways that we might feel hungry or full. They also work with abstinence violation effects and do forgiveness meditation, loving kindness practices to help when we're in pain in this way. Here's a little meditation that you could try on your own. It usually works best after doing some breath or walking meditation. Begin by doing the raisin eating meditation like we did earlier in the course. Or if you don't like raisin, choose any other small piece of dried fruit or a similarly healthy morsel. And then try doing the same deliberate eating meditation with a food like chocolate, fudge, potato chips, ice cream, or whatever other food you find seductive but is kind of unhealthy. I often find that after a while, I habituate to the unhealthy food, and the ooh-goody excitement about eating it tends to drop away, and it's not so satisfying. In fact, I find foods that are engineered to be addictive, things like potato chips or extremely sweet and other fatty snacks, tend to feel like too intense. Their lack of nutrients or the lack of more subtle flavor variations becomes apparent. Another practice that you might try is buffet meditation. Here you go to a party or a buffet with the intention of practicing mindful eating. See if you can notice when hunger plays a role versus when your eyes are bigger than your stomach, and pay particular attention to the sensations of fullness. The trick is to eat slowly enough so your digestive system has enough time to signal your brain when you've had enough. And then once you feel full, you practice saying no thank you to people who offer you more. And then you can notice all of the thoughts and feelings that arise eating in this setting. I actually find that the only times that I'm not at all eating disordered are when I'm on an intensive meditation retreat. All of the rest of the time, I'm eating to some degree to self-soothe, to some degree to distract myself. And when I sit in intensive meditation retreat, my food intake starts to drop lower and lower and lower. The first few times that I'm having a meal, well, it's a big entertainment, the meal during a retreat, so I tend to fill the plate up rather full. But then I find that I can't get through it because I actually notice the feelings of fullness. And that makes me want to stop sooner. You don't want to be a waster, so each time I go back for food at another sitting at the meditation retreat, at another meal, I wind up taking less and less, and it takes several times before I realize that I only need much less food than I normally would take when I'm eating mindfully. Now, often people find that the excitement of eating all we want in a buffet setting or at a party is actually more of the draw than the actual sensual experience of eating it. And when mindfully eating in that kind of setting, the feeling of fullness makes us want to stop much earlier than we otherwise might. I'd like to share with you an example of mindfulness in action and how it can help with an addiction. This is a story of one of my patients with the details of his life disguised a bit to protect his confidentiality. He's a successful businessman. He grew up as a sensitive guy who was pretty emotional. He felt feelings a lot. And that wasn't such a great fit for his family, where he had some very rough brothers and a father who was very dismissive of emotions. So he grew up with a lot of inadequacy feelings. And on top of this, he had been small as a kid, and the early rejections that he had as a child really stung, and they really stuck with him. He discovered drugs and alcohol as an adolescent and instantly had a social group. He was tremendously relieved, both because he had a social group and because the drugs and alcohol made his feelings of inadequacy go away. He also really enjoyed getting high. He felt like he could have fun, play, be successful, be the man of the party. So he had both positive and negative reinforcement of his conditioned drug-taking and drinking behavior. As often happens, after a while, almost all of his social connections involved drugs and alcohol. So anytime he'd get together with friends, it would be about getting high. After being in treatment with me for a while, he had a dream. And in the dream, he arrives at the intersection of a maze. The path to the left goes up a hill, and it's full of obstacles and dangers and difficulties. The path to the right looks much easier, it slopes downward, and it's wide open. The problem is the path to the right, ultimately, when he'd go down it, leads to a sewer with no exit. And the only choice when you get down to the sewer is to come back up to the intersection again. Again and again in the dream, he comes to the same intersection, goes down to the right, takes the easier path, only to discover that he's got to come back up and be stuck at the same intersection. The dream is a wonderful metaphor for how troublesome habits work. They seem to provide an easy path, but ultimately they lead us to some very unsatisfying places. Now, I taught my patient mindfulness practice to notice that he can actually bear the feelings, even feelings of inadequacy, of rejection, of smallness, of failure. And if he stays with them as moment-to-moment experiences in the body, they actually change by themselves. He needn't do anything to fix the problem. And this was really a revelation, because since adolescence, he had treated all discomfort as a kind of crisis, something that needed to be handled with drugs or alcohol. And he was very good at mixing and selecting just those drugs and alcohol products to make the feeling go away. But he had simply never noticed that physical and emotional pain is usually self-limiting. Using mindfulness practice, he could see another pathway through them. His work these days is to reorient his whole goals, from feeling good, which had been the goal, to simply being present to what is. It's not always easy, sometimes the feelings are overwhelming, and he needs supports from other people. But when he's able to have freedom as his goal, rather than orchestrating a pleasant state and avoiding emotional pain as his goal, he's much, much happier.